Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this latest IFG Live event. You may not have noticed this week with all the excitement about the US elections and indeed with England, at least, entering lockdown 2. But Brexit is still going on in the background. And indeed, we are now into what must be deemed to be the final phase of Brexit, with that famous deadline for the end of transition leaving looming on the 31st of December. So today we're going to focus on actually how on earth can the government get any cut through on Brexit at a time when everybody else is more interested in other things. So we're looking at that communications challenge and the communications challenge on Brexit. Of course, government don't accept that premise. They banned the use of the B word, and some of my other colleagues did a word count at the Conservative Party conference, where the most notable thing was the fact that nobody mentioned Brexit at all, because Brexit is, after all, done. But it may be done in one sense. We've left the EU. There's no going back now. But there's still a major challenge in getting people ready. Deal or no deal. And as we've seen, we still don't know, even at this very late stage, whether it's deal or no deal. And as Michael Gove and David Frost have told Parliament, Canada, code for deal, and Australia, the very helpful branding of no deal with its connotations of sunshine, kangaroos and Kylie Minogue, are similar, but not identical. So business, others still in a bit of a bind there. So what to do, how to get over the message on needing to prepare while still communicating the government's message that Brexit was worth it. So I'm joined by a stellar lineup of people to take us through and unpack that challenge. And please, to make this event even more exciting, pile in your questions. I'm Jill Rutter. I'm a senior fellow here at the Institute for Government.
So the great thing about doing webinars is that I couldn't really hear any of that. I did hear my name and something about comms challenge. So I'm going to make up a question, which is much easier than doing a press briefing and try and answer it. I think you were saying, Jill, sorry, that it kind of, what would I be doing now, or what are the challenges? And I thought maybe it might be helpful to try and lay out the challenges about why this is a really difficult thing to communicate. So to begin with, I think there's a certain amount of genuine Brexit messaging fatigue that the public are going through. When James and I were number 10 staffers, which feels a long time ago now because it was, we had a program of pre-agreeing a deal, trying to get people ready for the change demands of what leaving the European Union would mean for businesses and stuff. So we had this program of technical notices, as they were called, and there were over 100 of the things, and there was an incredibly complicated sort of clearance process. But essentially, it sort of said for particular sectors what is going to happen and what's going to be different when you leave the EU. So we had a few of those. We had, preparation to try to, in the run up to European councils and things, where there was at least a possibility of leaving without a deal if we were going for an extension. We weren't sure we were going to get one. There were those kind of things, and that's the origin, I suppose, of this sort of campaign. Then, of course, you had, an election last time. We had a get ready for Brexit program. We've now got a new comms campaign, and I suppose it's just there's a certain amount of repetition that the public and business have had to put up with. I don't think it's anybody's fault, but you can understand why, if you are told that you're going to the brink 4 or 5 times and it never quite happens, you might disengage with it after a couple of instances of that. So I think the essential problem and the challenge is one of cut through, but realistically it's made a lot harder by the fact that we are living through a once in a 75-year news cycle. It would be difficult, I think, because of that weariness that I talked about, to meaningfully communicate precisely what people should do when it comes to preparing for Brexit, even without the fact that we're in this completely unprecedented situation where people are genuinely fearful, given everything that's going on with COVID. I mean, the only thing I would say, though, that's kind of a bit more of a positive, having tried to explain without a great deal of eloquence the challenge, generally speaking, when it comes to these sorts of campaigns and responding to them, people do so late. So the fact that you've had a significant amount, maybe some people would say anyway, of non-engagement or limited engagement with preparedness and all that sort of thing, which is, I think, understandable given the uncertainty. It's also the case that when people do snap their attention and turn their head towards something, when government communicates it, it tends to be late, and anybody who has ever filled in a tax return will tell you that. So that's my sort of opening start, given that I helpfully couldn't hear the question.
Thank you very much, Paul. And I'm going to step in because I think we have lost Jill, unfortunately, due to some internet gremlins. But I mean, you picked up on some really interesting themes there, particularly around sort of the fact that people maybe only turn to these messages quite late. People are Brexit fatigued, and the fact that obviously we're dealing with not just a very complicated Brexit communications message this year, but also communicating about COVID and about very pressing sort of public health messages as well. I thought I might turn to you, James, and sort of pick up on, I mean, given all of those challenges that Paul outlined, I suppose, where are the public with Brexit? I suppose, how engaged have they been in Brexit this year after, as Jill said at the start, we sort of got Brexit done in January, and particularly sort of where, I suppose, for the communications challenge for the next couple of months, what is a starting point? You know, how prepared or how aware of the changes coming are the public at the moment?
Yeah, it's certainly, well, as Paul alludes to there, even, last year before that, there was this general sense of Brexit fatigue from the public that was very clear in the research. That has, been amplified even more so now because of coronavirus. Many people sort of view Brexit increasingly as a bit of a distraction. It's sort of lower in the issues agenda when you ask the public, what are the most important issues facing the country. It's much lower than it was at this time last year. And in focus groups, when you bring it up, when you bring even just the word Brexit up, it tends to prompt sort of laughter, derision, because people can't quite believe this is being talked about. They think this is something that was resolved last year, and in the middle of a pandemic, people almost can't quite believe it. So it's certainly a difficult environment to be engaged in. There's also that get Brexit done element, which is really, really important. I think one of the key ways to understand that December 2019 general election is that it wasn't won by the Conservatives because of a Brexit culture war. It was won because it was a Brexit boredom war. People were so desperate to just stop talking about the thing that actually the Conservative message of, let's get this put to one side, meant that they won very decisively amongst quite a lot of Conservative leaning Remain voters as well as Leave voters. Now that matters to this because the downside of that success is that now a lot of people do think it is done or is way on the way to being done, and therefore not they don't need much to worry about it. And that clearly has had a bit of an impact in that regard too. So those pre-existing things, the fatigue, and also general skepticism of sort of messages about threats arising from Brexit that was there beforehand, past this impact of COVID, does mean it's a more difficult environment. But I would say though that although the public are not sort of currently hugely sort of plugged into this, I would completely agree with Paul's point about the last minute nature of this. I mean, if you look at searches on Google for the word Brexit on Google Trends, it's really interesting because basically for the whole of 2017 and 2018, when, I mean, certainly I think Paul and I could say that we felt like we were thinking about Brexit most days. It's very, very low. It only really spikes at those moments of sort of crisis or high political drama. So it may be, as Paul alludes to, that it's the last minute nature of this where this really sort of comes in. And of course, there are different audiences. Although the general public might not be particularly plugged in, certainly many of these, certainly a YouGov poll back in last month, showed that actually a few of these businesses are saying they feel prepared, even if they're quite critical of the government's campaign to date. So yeah, a difficult context for the public, but yeah, the more technical the message, and amping up that last minute nature of it, it may mean it may yet cut through.
So I'm going to come back in now, hopefully. James, still again. Do you think it matters that the government's refusing to use the Brexit word? Is that hampering their ability to communicate, or is that actually a politically very savvy thing to do, given that the election was fought on getting Brexit done?
Yeah, I think I mean, it's an interesting example, I think, where the sort of political and the sort of technical aims, I suppose, are slightly different, because clearly you can understand why they want to say that, and clearly, you know, I'm sure in their focus groups they're hearing the same as in mine, where, you know, people sort of recoil at the use of that word. I suppose the problem, and of course there's another political benefit, of course, in you know, sort of framing no deal as a you know, Australian style trade deal, which might be a bit misleading. But what is certainly the case, though, is that you know, on the other hand, the technical aim is actually, as you say, you know, a need to remind people of the existence of Brexit and of the need to do it. I think this campaign probably can work without using the B word. I think in many ways it might help. I mean, certainly some of the more effective government campaigns when I was in Number 10 were those much more sort of technical, you know, fill out your tax return, you know, make sure you you know, you fill out this by this time, or here's some information on the national living wage, or here's how you know, here's how you're eligible for this benefit, or whatever else. You know, it may be that actually a very sort of, you know, self-focused, you know, technical, this is what you need to do now, without bringing in that word, could well be a better way of getting this message across. And that you know, that's where, you know, in fairness to the government, this sort of time is running out slogan they've got now, they're clearly seeing the same pressures that we're seeing, and they're clearly seeing that public not quite zoomed in. And I think they're hoping that, you know, by amping up the sort of danger of that message, then it will start to cut through.
Lisa, I wanted to come to you now. James has sort of said, well, actually, business is getting prepared despite some of the sort of rhetoric around this and the sort of concerns that have been expressed. But both James and Paul have compared preparing for Brexit to like filling in your tax return, which I think nobody sees as, I have the opportunity to fill in my tax return. I'm really looking forward to it. How far do you think the government's ability to communicate about Brexit has been compromised by determination, certainly in the summer, to focus as much on the opportunities from Brexit as on the immediate tasks and compliance costs of Brexit? And what do you think? What's your assessment of what business still needs to know and to do?
Okay, so Jill, if I could just go back to something that you had said earlier in your introductory remarks. You talked about the challenge of political messaging and how you convey that along with the message that the public needs to receive. And I think in that lies the central problem and the central tension. The communications needed for Brexit, and I must say I disagree with some of the earlier comments. I think there's never been a time when the word Brexit is needed more. There should be a Brexit website, etc. Now, I'll just go back to that. But I think the problem is with the communications at the moment, the government is still wrapped up in the politics of Brexit, and there really needs to be a completely utterly separate silo of communications that is aimed at an outcome which has changed behaviour. So what we see now in communications towards business, aimed at business, is something that is kind of political. It's about blame. It's about you're not ready. We've heard all those messages from Michael Gove in Parliament, and this is reflected in the current campaign. If you go to the YouTube version of the current 30-second advert, you'll see that it launched on the 19th of October. It's been seen by about 10,000 people. Jill, I think in our off-camera remarks, was rightly pointing out that when we're all watching non-linear TV, we're racing through the adverts. So, I mean, I'd go back to this idea of the need to communicate the message to the public. And I think when you look at campaigns in other countries, for example, the Netherlands, when you consider France, where you consider Ireland, there's a very different approach. So in this country, I would liken the approach here to the use of a stick. If you're not ready, you're going to be in trouble. In Ireland, there's a very plain, completely different approach, which is businesses, you have to be ready. Come get your €9,000 now for every employee you need to train to get up to speed with customs declarations, etc. It's a carrot, and I think that's what's missing here. And there's an absolute failure of communications. 56 days to go. Lots and lots of businesses aren't ready. The IFG's report earlier this week on getting ready for are we ready for Brexit? Joe, you'll remind me of the correct title, but in that there was a really interesting statistic which showed that a third of small businesses still think the transition period can be extended. 56 days to go and the message hasn't got through.
So, Joe, coming to you on this, what messages? The government's not got that much time. It still doesn't know whether it's a deal or no deal. Clearly a preference for a deal. That's what the official line is anyway. What does it need to prioritise in this, you know, the title you didn't give your report, the final countdown to the end of the year?
Well, I think as we sort of heard from the other panelist, it's just a very complicated task, basically. There is no uniform message to get across. There's no uniform audience. And there are lots of different things. Yeah, as we know, large businesses with big public affairs teams are better prepared and know what's going on with Brexit. Sole traders or individuals might not have been following at all, think Brexit's done, don't realise that things are going to be changing at the end of the year. And I think in our report, we identified sort of 3 big areas where readiness is a big concern. One is the Northern Ireland Protocol, one is the GB-EU border, but sort of underlying all of these issues is this issue of sort of business preparedness, which sort of cuts across the board and cuts across different sectors. And I think the things that the government needs to be doing are sort of some of the things picked up by others. I think it is about hammering home that message that has started to come through, but come through quite late. This sort of time is running out. I think over summer, the IFG was relatively critical of the approach to comms, which was focusing on sort of selling the opportunities of Brexit. It was sort of perhaps underplaying the consequences of not being ready. And I think in hindsight, when we look back now, when we had a bit of space over summer where the coronavirus wasn't quite as prevalent, where there perhaps was a bit more space to push home some of those messages and get businesses to prepare. And I know the government always planned to sort of go hard towards the end, picking up on points that Paul said about the fact that people come round to these things late. But actually, we always knew when the government chose not to ask for an extension to the transition period, but it was going to have to be communicating coronavirus and Brexit simultaneously. We always knew that the winter was going to be difficult on COVID front. And so I think there was this opportunity potentially to have sort of pushed home that sort of time is running out, you've got to act now message earlier on, which perhaps didn't happen. I think a couple of other important points that the government will need to sort of be frank about at some point soon is, I think, the fact that preparing for Brexit does not end at the end of the year, but basically, whilst there are lots of changes coming at the end of the year, the government has delayed some new changes that are coming in. So it's delaying some of the checks on imports at the border. It's delaying the switch to some new regulatory regimes, basically to buy business and itself a bit more time to get ready. But that means it's quite a complicated picture because you're going to have all of these staggered deadlines to prepare for certain things next year. So I think the government's going to have to really push quite hard beyond the end of this year to keep people preparing for those deadlines. I also think they need to be quite realistic that, given where we are, given the poor state of preparedness, it is just not feasible that everyone is going to be ready for everything they need to do in January, particularly some of those small businesses. And there is going to be potentially this area where people might have to turn up and try and go to the border without the right documentation and be turned away and fined under the new systems before they are they are pushed into actually acting and taking these steps. And there is likely to be disruption, particularly at the border, but other areas as well, particularly around Northern Ireland potentially, in January, while these sort of final preparations are put in place. And I think the other sort of final big point I'd say about the government's messaging up until January is that, I think this point of deal or no deal is really important. Basically, most of what needs to happen will not change regardless of the outcome of negotiations. So the big things that are going to change at the end of the year are a consequence of the fact that deal or no deal, the UK is going to leave the single market and customs union. There are going to be customs checks. There are going to be different regulatory regimes and things like chemicals and product standards in the UK and EU, and businesses are going to have to comply with both. There is going to be a new UK immigration system for businesses and individuals to prepare for. And if you're travelling to Europe as an individual to work, live, study, after January, there's going to be different requirements and it is going to be more onerous. And I think getting that message across is really important. And I'm not sure that it has cut through. And I think there's a bit of a risk that this sense that a deal could come and save the day. And actually, it's a really difficult sell for the government. A deal is a victory. We've hard fought, we've done really well, but you still need to do most of the things we told you needed to do for no deal last year.
Yeah, Paul and James, I want to come back to you. Paul, I'm going to come to you first and then I'll come to Lisa. We've got a question from Adam Payne, Paul, specifically at you. Do you think Theresa May's repeated claim that no deal is better than a bad deal was helpful in terms of encouraging people and businesses to take Brexit preparation seriously enough? And if I could add to that, do you think the government has a harder sell job if there's a deal to get people ready than if there's no deal, which I think people do realise will be quite disruptive, but most people think do a deal, and this might have been true actually of at least some elements of Theresa May's Chequers proposal, do a deal and all those problems go away and I can start planning for Christmas, dealing with COVID and do my tax return. Paul.
Assuming that that's Adam Payne of Business Insider fame, it's nice to know that you really can't hide or get away from the lobby anywhere. They do follow you around. So I think, look, no deal is better than a bad deal, you know, as well as being, I guess, factually true. I would argue, at least, wasn't a preparedness phrase. It was a negotiating phrase. You know, it was about trying to convey to the EU that we weren't going to do a deal at any price. Obviously, that was sort of, you know, slightly eclipsed by the fact we didn't do a deal at all. But regardless, you know, I don't think you can conflate those two things. As I say, that's not the purpose of what it was. I do recognise, I suppose, the separate and slightly wider point you make, Jill, which is that in deal situation there are going to be challenges, and I think that, you know, there will be a public perception and, you know, I suppose some actuality that the government has to manage, which, yeah, exactly as you say, you know, things will feel different in a deal situation. So we've sort of been in this slightly, I suppose, phony war where, you know, we've extended the transition period, and so we have left the European Union, but nothing feels different. And of course, we're about to leave the European Union as well as legally. We're going to leave it practically at the beginning of next year, and ultimately at that point it will feel different. So, you know, particularly if you do something that participates with the EU single market and is, you know, is not goods based, even if there is a deal, it will feel very, very different. So that is something that I think the government will have to manage, because ultimately, you know, there will be, you know, quite profound differences in both deal and no deal situations, but you probably would get a certain amount of public expectation that that would be the case in a no deal situation. You might not in a deal situation. The only other thing I'd say, just practically in terms of kind of cut through, because I suppose I'm still sort of programmed to think like that, is that before the end of the year, there will be a moment either where a deal is agreed and there'll be a certain amount of fanfare and a certain amount of right-wing Tory anger and a certain amount of disappointment from other people, but a deal will be agreed, possibly. If that happens, there will be a lot of media coverage. You know, people will start to hear about this on the news, they will start to see it on their Twitter feeds, they will start to read about it in newspapers again. That's equally true of no deal. It possibly will be amplified, actually, if it's no deal. But either way, there will be a big moment that the government can, you know, use to focus people's minds again, and that moment is unavoidable in either a deal or a no deal situation. So there are some grounds for kind of optimism in terms of increased engagement.
Lisa, do you want to come in on that? Do you think that it's hard to communicate around a deal and all the changes that are needed? We had Carolyn Fairbairn telling the CBI conference today, just do a deal, business is desperate for a deal, giving the impression that that would remove a whole heap of problems. Obviously remove tariffs, but not necessarily much more. Lisa.
I think the challenge in communications exists, deal or no deal. As everybody knows who's listening to this call, the regulatory checks come in on the 1st of January, November. They may be phased in Great Britain, but they are kick in on the 1st of January, come what may, in Northern Ireland. And I think there is a lot of confusion. Probably, I guess if I went out on my high street and asked people if they thought anything was going to change in January the 1st, they would say no. I think there's a complete gap in the communications, which is Brexit is coming, there will be changes, X, Y, and Z. And one of the really impactful areas would be, as I think it was Joe that just mentioned there, the immigration system changes from January the 1st. And I think that will have an impact on every single, well, it will have an impact on every single employer in the country. And already I'm receiving as a reporter, nothing very strong, but anecdotal evidence that the smaller employers don't know the law. So I had one charity ring me this week with an Italian who's going for a job in very low paid minimum wage job, and was told that his Italian ID wasn't sufficient to qualify him for working in Britain. And I just think we're going to see a lot of that. We are going to see EU citizens' rights imperiled. We're going to see landlords who are going to turn away EU citizens. We will see British citizens have problems in Europe. I've got many cases of all very small stories, not hugely impactful in terms of cut through to the public, but there are a million British citizens that the UK government must have responsibility for who live in the EU who are going to be impacted. So those are the immediate things that need to be communicated. And like I say, I think there's never been a time where Brexit, there should be a Brexit website. I think COVID has shown us that the government can communicate to the public when it wants. Why isn't there a Brexit panel alongside that bright yellow, yolk yellow COVID alert on every government website, on every public authority website, on every public sector website? Brexit is coming. You need to take action.
Very interesting your point about EU citizens, Lisa, because we had a question from Richard Ward asking slightly separate question about, does the panel think the government should have done more to publicise the EU settlement scheme to EU nationals in the UK? Of course, 4 million people have registered, which is quite a success, but quite interesting about whether the other people at the receiving end know enough about the status of those EU nationals at the moment and how that changes. James, you wanted to come in, and then I might go to Joe to see if he's got anything to say about some of the sort of outstanding communications challenges around the immigration.
It's interesting that point, Jill, about the EU nationals, because that is, from a sort of government comms perspective, a much harder group to reach. Tends to sort of overlap with those demographics that are just generally a little bit harder to reach. People live slightly more transient lives, slightly tend to be in sort of bigger cities. So there are some, and also they have less sort of link and interface with government. So that's certainly a challenge. I just think on the Brexit thing, I think in terms of the use of the word, I mean, I think what we have to remember here is that this is a target audience, at least on the public side. I appreciate this might be different for businesses, but at least on the public side, this is a public that recoils at the word Brexit and actually switches them off. So I think actually taking, and I don't think the government is in this place yet, but I think they've already taken Brexit out, but by taking the sort of I think the less sort of sunlit uplands, sort of political messaging around this, and the more technical, the more this is what you need to do now, probably the better. My worry with that Brexit word is, and I'm not suggesting this is how the government have arrived at this conclusion, but my worry about it is that actually that's exactly the thing that does switch people off and put their fingers in their ears. Just one quick thing on the point around a deal situation. I think that is the biggest risk now, actually, for the government in terms of this campaign, because it's very easy to see. I mean, as I say, the public at the moment that aren't really thinking about Brexit, I think if they see the deal story, they'll see it for a couple of days and then kind of absolutely think, this is done and dusted. I don't need to think about this now. So I think that's the biggest risk. I would agree with Paul that, to get around that, the government need to just really embrace that couple of days where they have that story. And, if there's an announcement or a clip or a press conference, whatever it might be, a PM moment, as people say internally, then that needs to really clearly involve a flag saying, and this is what you now need to do, and you now need to go online here. I think otherwise, if that moment passes without a moment like that, then it will be very difficult to energize people and make people see, what they have to do coming forward, because the assumption will be deal equals no action.
But James, just to challenge you, I'll come back to you on that. How do you manage to combine the message, I pulled off this great deal for the UK, and now you really, really need to confront that means absolutely masses of red tape, much more inconvenience in all the things, to check your phone contract for roaming charges, get your fill out these forms, hire hard to find customs agents. How on earth politically do you do that?
Yeah, and that's going to be the challenge, and it's going to be interesting to see whether Number 10 have the appetite to combine those two messages. But look, if it is there is a way of framing that without it being without it sounding like it's a catastrophe, right? You are able to say, please go on to our nice shiny website, and to be fair, compared to other governments, gov.uk is a very, very usable, good interface that people do use. It's just getting them there in the first place. So yeah, I totally agree, Joe. That's not going to be the most palatable political line. I'm sure that the Prime Minister would love to go up, announce a deal, and then sort of say, the work's done. But I do think there probably is a way of framing it. Just whether the political appetite there is another question.
Okay, Paul, I might come to you on that in a bit, but let's get on. Joe, I started to come back to you about the sort of nature of the challenge about communicating the immigration changes. Obviously, EU citizens in the UK are one target audience. Questions about whether the UK has done enough to communicate to British citizens in the EU to make sure they're securing their rights, but also to all those people who have to do the checks. Obviously, the government will be worried about any repetition of the Windrush, people losing jobs unnecessarily, not having their rights exercised. Do you think the government's doing enough to communicate that to employers and landlords, etc.?
I think you're right, Jill, that immigration is one of those areas which just demonstrates the complexity of what the government is facing, because you're right that we have the settled status scheme for EU nationals living in the UK now, and generally the government has done quite a good job there, especially compared to some other EU states. As you say, 4 million people registered, and I think the big problem there is that we don't know how many EU citizens still need to register. The government has given a grace period until the middle of next year for people to register with that scheme. But there is a big question, a policy question, about how you deal with people who have not registered in time. And at the moment, it looks like you're going to be able to register late if you have a good excuse or a reasonable excuse. But in other immigration contexts, that is a very high bar, normally for things like people being hospitalized, for instance. So there will be a big question there about how the government handles that and sort of how it works there. I think sort of leveled onto that is the fact that it's not just the settled status scheme. The government is having to communicate two things side by side, which is the existing settled status scheme, but also from January, a new immigration system. And in the first half of next year, you're going to have people who might be eligible for the settled status scheme and getting them to register, and then other people who aren't eligible, who you're trying to push into the new immigration system. And as you say, a lot of UK immigration enforcement is done behind the border. It's done by employers when they take on new staff. It's done by landlords when they take on new tenants who check that you have the right paperwork. And we know during the grace period that they will be able to use, EU citizens will be able to use their EU passport or ID to show that they have the right to live or work in the UK. That does raise some difficult questions about what happens to EU nationals who turn up after the end of the year. Will they be able to sort of get by because they don't need to prove that they arrived before the end of the transition period? We don't really know there, and there's a bit of uncertainty for employers about whether or not they are even allowed to ask when you arrived, or whether they have to just take that sort of EU documentation at face value. I also think there's a sort of big challenge for them in just sort of preparing for the new system. So I think this is another area where the short time frame left poses a big challenge, because particularly for employers, if you're going to use the new immigration system, you need to register as a visa sponsor. Now, there are only about 30,000 odd visa sponsor companies in the UK at the moment. There are potentially tens, hundreds of thousands of businesses who have only ever employed from the UK or EU and have never had to really engage with a visa sponsorship system before. Now, it can take a few weeks to set up, get your application in order. It can take a little bit of time for Home Office to turn that around. So if you start working back from the 1st of January, there isn't very much time to prepare. Plus, if you build in a 3-month notice period that someone might have before they work, there are some firms who might not have prepared, who might be in a position where they are unable to hire someone from the EU on the 1st of January because they're not ready and haven't taken the steps. So I think there's sort of a concrete example there of how not being prepared really could have practical impact. So I think on immigration, basically, the government's done quite a good job on settled status so far, but it has pushed some problems down the road potentially. It has some big decisions to take about how it's going to deal with those, particularly in light of Windrush, particularly in light of the fact it's pushed back on having physical documentation for settled to prove your settled status. It is going to have to be careful about how it manages that. But at the same time, it needs to sort of sell and put in place its new immigration system, the details of which it's left quite late in the day as well. And it needs to sort of get businesses, landlords and others to know exactly what set of rules they need to apply to which people and when.
Thanks very much, Joe. Lisa, I've got a question here from Joe Edgerton, who's suggesting that basically the TV advertising isn't really aimed at business. It's more aimed at convincing the public that it's business's fault for not preparing. I don't know whether you share that sort of slightly cynical view, but there has been a sense, not least from Lord Agnew, that business should be getting on with this. But I wondered whether you could tell us about the sort of other channels the government's using. Should we take at face value the ads that, as you were saying, we can fast forward through, or are there lots of other communication channels being used, like HMRC contacts and working groups and trade associations? Or is what we see what we get?
Yes, yes, of course there is. The government has been engaging with stakeholders, all the trade associations, from the big players like the CBI membership, the Tesco's, the Rolls-Royce, etc. We've got the car manufacturing SMMT, very, very strong, very vocal organisation. And then we've got all the logistics people, Logistics UK, Road Haulage Association, who are also very vocal. But in between, you've got the very, very specialists like the air, defence, aviation, ports, etc. So the government is engaging. But I think one of the issues was, and keep going back to this, is how the messaging has been basically, it's been compromised by the need for political messaging, for virtue signaling, if you like, to your Brexit backbenchers. So we know quite recently Michael Gove stood up in the House of Commons and said that the Road Haulage Association was not a constructive partner. They had requested a meeting with him to go through the really urgent detail of what is needed for truckers and the logistics industry to do by the end of the year. And they complained that the meeting was then changed to a meeting with many stakeholders, therefore diluting the amount of time that they had with the Secretary of State, and also the amount of time with the officials, which are the ones that are actually working on communications. So just to come back to the original question, I think the civil service has been really, really good. The micro messaging, the individual updates for every T that's crossed and I that's dotted, in all areas impacted by Brexit. There are alerts. I get them, sometimes you kind of 30 alerts from gov.uk on one line changing on a Department of Transport piece of advice. But we go back to this issue about how do you communicate with these businesses. For example, yesterday, in preparation for this, I went around the websites to see what the kind of Brexit messaging was. And you go to the key ones, HMRC, Cabinet, Downing Street, DEFRA, DFT Home Office. So the DFT, scroll down about 2 screens, you get this interesting thing that was announced yesterday. They revealed 5 lorry parks are going to have advice centres. They didn't press release that. They didn't communicate that. I spoke to the Road Haulage Association. They said yes, it had been communicated, but it wasn't communicated in a mass communications way. And it said that on the 15th of November, they were going to announce 40 more. I think what they should be doing far more, which is something that they were doing at No Deal and other countries were doing during no deal planning last year. You should have officials, HMRC officials on ferries. You should have leafleting in parks. In Calais, you should have multi-language. Eurotunnel have raised this, multilingual leafleting, communications in Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, where a lot of these lorries are registered, even if they have UK ownership, like DHL, etc. I think there's a mass piece of communications work to be done, and if they're going to turn it on after a deal is done or no deal, we get to conclusion on that. I don't know. There's no sign of it.
That's really interesting. I think some questions there about how feasible some of those things that you might have done in other times are when all sides are being hit by handling the pandemic as well. James, I want to change tack a bit. We've got a question from Anonymous, which I'm going to put to you as the man who asked the public where they are. We've got a sort of comment. The Brexit debate was characterised by mistrust in government on one side, mistrust of Europe on the other. Has this changed? I suppose, do people mistrust government more? I don't know. Has this changed following the government's mishandling of the pandemic? Does the public think the government's mishandled the pandemic, and will that have any sort of wider implications for how it views their handling of Brexit? I suppose be an interesting question.
Yeah, very, very interesting question. I think certainly I've certainly seen change in the focus groups that I've done since the start of the pandemic. I mean, at the very start, people were very positive about how the government had handled it. I mean, obviously had the very clear message going into the first lockdown, and then things sort of slowly shifted, and I think a sort of combination of confusion about message, frustration with some of the preparedness, like on test and trace, track and trace, for example. And also just a building fatigue, right? I mean, one of the things I think that is obviously very relevant today as we go into our second lockdown is that doing something the first time is usually easier than having to repeat it. And I think these a lot of the public do just feel fatigued, and certainly in the focus groups that I run, it would have been impossible to say. No one would have admitted during the first lockdown that they had broken the rules, but I now see many more people saying that they're breaking or plan to break the rules in focus group when they're on camera, like we are now. So that social stigma has gone too. So yeah, combination of confusion, frustration, and fatigue has certainly meant that trust in government has gone down in relation to coronavirus. You still do get a bit of particularly amongst sort of voters in the red wall and conservative voters, people who voted Conservative for the first time, still do tend to say, well, actually, look, no government could have handled this any better. This is an unprecedented situation. So you do get that line, which is important, and I expect that Number 10 are counting on. But yeah, look, there's no doubt about the trust decline. I'm not entirely convinced that feeds massively through to the Brexit thing. It's very much framed in terms of the exact rules, and that wonderful Matt Lucas parody video, which has come up in I used to be able to say all, but in my last focus group it didn't come up, but almost all of my focus groups since May, that video came up. So it's very framed through COVID, but no, certainly that is something that has happened, and I'm sure to some extent that does have an impact.
Paul, do you think the government will pay a political price in terms of, we've been talking about trust, if it doesn't do the deal? Do you think there'd be a political price to pay, or will the government be able to sort of pin that on EU intransigence? I think we saw some polling that suggested that most people would blame the government if there was no deal, but I don't know how robust that is. Would you be worried about that?
I think, yeah, look, I mean, inevitably, it depends on who you can characterize as being most at fault. So, there has obviously been an attempt to say recently and to characterize the debate as being about EU intransigence, i.e., we just want our rights as an independent country, and because the EU is not necessarily recognizing that, we had this sort of slightly choreographed walkout not that long ago. The thing is that a political price, I guess as veterans of Theresa May's administration could tell you, like, comes in lots of forms, right? So, you know, if they do a deal, clearly there will be sections of the Conservative Parliamentary Party that are unhappy about that. There is also a question about, the price of the additional disruption that would probably happen in the event of no deal, and then who the public blame. So, you know, the truth really is that there isn't a cost-free option for the government here, because they're struggling to kind of keep together a fracturing party. But, you know, I suspect, and, you know, James will know better from his, you know, his actual evidence rather than my slightly ropey anecdotes, but you know, that there will be a cost in the public mind probably for not agreeing a deal. You will, however, make a you know, a relatively smaller group of people very happy.
That's very quickly come in on that, Jill.
Yeah, James.
Yeah, just to say on that, I think this is where I think the most has changed since last year. I think this time last year, if we were asking this question of, you know, would the public be up for a no-deal Brexit? I think they probably would have, because as in you know, the Leave and the voters that Conservatives would need to win an election, obviously not the whole public, but there would have been a lot more permission for that, because you know, there was a frustration. It felt like there was no way out. People were desperate for it to be over, and also there was a real sort of feeling of grievance with the EU. I think that has now shifted, and certainly in my focus groups with Leave voters, it was very interesting around sort of September, when we sort of had the internal markets bill and sort of, you know, the sort of a more of a sense of conflict with the EU. A lot of people couldn't really understand why that was. It was a lot harder to sort of work out what the grievance was, and therefore that didn't really convert into any political boost for the government. I remember quite a few commentators saying, well, you know, when all that was kicking off, that actually this was going to lead to a boost amongst for Boris Johnson amongst Leave voters. In fact, the opposite happened, and the ratings continue to tick down, largely due to COVID. So we're not seeing that sort of political dividend come from no deal, or the prospect of no deal in the same way now, and I wouldn't really expect that to change. You know, last year people were annoyed with the EU because they thought they were trying to keep us in. This time there isn't that same sense of grievance.
Lisa, we've got a question here from Federico Bianchi from the EU delegation to the UK. Hi, Federico. Asked whether we thought that the EU should have been communicating more directly, engaging more with the British public in the talks. I don't know whether you have any impression of how the EU has been or not been speaking directly, or on tenterhooks for any pronouncement by Monsieur Barnier, but what do you make of that?
I think that's a very cheeky question from a representative of the EU in London, Federico. I think, don't we all know that the EU had its hands tied behind its back, that it couldn't interfere with a decision made by a sovereign nation. I mean, we had a lot of communications towards the end of last year from the Irish government, because the Irish border was the big sticking point. And I would have argued at the time that I thought it would have been better had the Irish government talked directly to the British public and really the British MPs who are making the decisions by going on the Today programme and Newsnight and key programmes like that. I mean, I don't know how many times I asked for an interview with Leo Varadkar over the 4 years, and every single one of them was denied. That's my answer, Federico.
Okay, Joe, you would come in. Joe?
Yes, sorry, getting my mic off. Yeah, I just I suppose just wanted to flag what I think, you know, for EU sort of comms is definitely a very sort of pressing issue as well. Obviously, it's not just about, you know, the EU speaking to people in the UK. It's also a lot about the EU speaking to people in the EU, because we know that, you know, avoiding disruption and sort of managing the transition from the end of the year doesn't just rely on the UK being ready and UK businesses and UK individuals. It also relies very much on EU side being ready. And we know, you know, 85% of the haulage market between the UK and EU, I think, as sort of Lisa was alluding to, is you know, EU registered hauliers. So it's yeah, it's definitely a big task. And I think we've seen very sort of mixed picture on the EU side as well about how effective they've been. I think it would be amiss to sort of have a whole session on comms and not mention the Netherlands Brexit Muppet character. So we've seen that some EU countries do a really run quite effective campaigns. I think particularly those countries that are most exposed to Brexit and the consequences of Brexit. So the Netherlands, Ireland, as Lisa mentioned, have these sort of comprehensive campaigns. And I think one thing that's they've sort of been able to benefit from, where we've seen good campaigns on the EU side, is they haven't faced the same political constraints as the UK. I think they have been able to be more frank and more open for longer about the trade-offs involved in the type of Brexit that the UK is pursuing, about the fact that there are going to be these big changes, about the fact basically the status quo isn't an option. And they've been able to hammer those messages quite clearly for quite some time without having to worry about selling, the upsides and opportunities. So I think that has been a really positive thing, and we've seen some creative use of mascots. So I mentioned the sort of Netherlands Brexit Muppet, which when it was launched ahead of a no deal last year, saw a 10-fold increase in the number of people visiting the Netherlands main Brexit landing page on their website overnight, which was very effective. Or I did notice when I had a look earlier, slightly tongue-in-cheek, but it seems to be far more prevalent on the Dutch language parts of the website than on the English language parts of the website. That has been very effective, but I think we should also be clear that it is a mixed picture across the EU. Some member states have not done very much to update their information this year. Some member states have really sort of left it and said, we'll tell you when a deal comes. Some have just pushed you towards the documents the Commission puts out, which are very dense, very technical, and quite often leave the practical details to member states to tell you exactly what it means if you're a business or an individual. And we know that business readiness and individual readiness in some member states, particularly France and some of the big member states, is very poor still. So there's some good things happening on the EU side, but it's not, I think everyone is struggling to get this message across, and everyone's having to deal with COVID at the same time.
Okay, we're in the final straits here, and I just wanted to, I'm going to challenge Lisa and Joe to say, what are the sort of 3 things that government needs to be most worried about on the critical first week of the new year? And then I'm going to challenge James and Paul to work out actually what would they be doing about it if they were back in number 10 in terms of preparing and in terms of conveying the messages while remaking the case for Brexit. Lisa, what's top of your list as the things that the government really needs to watch out for early into the new year? I
think we haven't touched on Northern Ireland, Jill, just briefly. As we know, all GB businesses who supply goods to Northern Ireland have got to get to grips with the paperwork, the customs declarations that they are all obliged to make from the 1st of January. I think that message hasn't got through to, I mean, presumably it's got through to the Tesco's and the big car companies and all of that, but it hasn't, not to the SMEs. So that's number 1. And number 2, I think the checks and the chaos on the roads, if we have that, it'll be mid-January, early to mid-January, and it will settle down. So although as a reporter, there's going to be a story there, I think the public would kind of expect that. They've been primed for that. So it might be politically the big problem for the government. But I do think the area that carries most risk is people. Those stories that we would be writing about EU citizens being turned down for jobs, being chucked out of flats, about British people not being able to come back to the country with their EU spouse. I've had, over the years, many stories that will get in our internal traffic system will show like over 1 million, 1.5, 2 million page views, which is huge considering the Guardian, in its heyday was selling hundreds of thousands. These have massive cut through, and I think those human interest stories are the ones. Those are the ones. If you find that Brits are being discriminated against, and you've got elderly people or you've got sick people in Europe that are being discriminated against, that's going to have ramifications, I think, for the politics and the responsibility taken by the government.
Joe, what would you add to the list? Anything?
I think I definitely agree with all of that. I think Northern Ireland is definitely a huge issue, and the fact that the UK government could do less on its own to waive checks and waive things unilaterally means that is a big issue, and there's going to have to be sort of conversations, we think, with the EU about how you mitigate those things. I think one of the two big things I'd point out, sort of problems in January. One, I think, is about how you maintain that momentum to carry on preparing for these things that are coming in later. Once you've had your big moment of change, how you actually convince people that things are happening. And the last one is just, I suppose, what you do with compliance as well. If people aren't ready, what is your message to them? Is it, we're going to hit you hard, you need to prepare? Or is it going to be, we're going to give you a bit of a tap on the wrist and next time you better do better? And I think there's a big question there about how the government handles that, particularly given, we know the circumstances have been really difficult to prepare, and we've always known that it's going to be difficult to make these changes, particularly this year.
James, coming to you, what would you, with those potential risks, but still obviously want to get over the political message that deal or no deal, this was the right choice? Perhaps one or two people have noted in the Q&A, perhaps against a bit of growing public disillusion about whether Brexit was really worth it or not, maybe not. How would you be thinking about going about your sort of comms from late deck into the end of January? Let's have a sort of period. Or would you just say, actually, COVID's so big, it's going to just dominate anyway, no one's going to notice any of these changes because life's so different?
Well, I think certainly, I think stepping up the research and making sure that they are getting a read of where the public are and which messages work best. I mean, they're obviously doing that and have already done that, but very important, I think, to do that again after a deal. In the event of a deal being agreed or not, to just see how that changes and which messages amplify the most. I think as Paul referred to earlier, and we talked about using that sort of moment of announcement, whenever that might be, to then sort of have a sort of a clear sort of PM moment on that, to just stress that, yes, good news, but also urgency, and I think making sure that feeds through any of the comms. And I think just in terms of landing the preparedness message, I think try and take the politics out of it as much as possible. Make this a technical thing that you have to do on X date. And inject that urgency. There's a bit of that already with the comms campaign, but really stressing that, getting away from, this being a Brexit battle, or this being an identity thing, or even, talking about, like I said earlier, the sunlit uplands. Just focus on, you need to do this on X date, because those more technical government comms campaigns do work very well. And the final thing I'd say is ensure this is properly resourced. This is going to have to be a big all channel blitz. It's going to, as one of the questioners mentioned, this needs to be something that's very tailored to business on the one hand, tailored to the public on the other. It might not be the most sort of popular thing at the moment, but ensuring this really does have the money behind it is going to be important, because each extra bit of money spent on this is probably saving lost money in terms of disruption at borders and with business.
Paul, coming to you last, you're former press secretary of the Prime Minister. You obviously didn't do on-camera press conferences, but we're told that they start on the 1st of January. Allegra Stratton will be standing up. If you were Allegra and starting to think now about what you needed to be most worried about and preparing for, how would you be putting yourself in the best position to have good answers on the 1st of January?
I mean, that's interesting. We'll see if it does happen on the 1st of January. But Allegra has a big and slightly unenviable job to do, because it's much easier, as you've seen from even me this morning, to sort of shuffle around and say slightly sarcastic things off camera than it is to do when someone's pointing a camera at you. So yeah, I think our sympathies to her, although it will in fairness be an amazing job. I mean, I've obviously suffered the huge disadvantage of trying to go last here, because JJ has said virtually everything sensible that there is to say on this topic. He's right about resourcing. There's been quite a lot about this sort of the 70 million quid that the government is spending. My understanding is they've spent about half that so far. So there is some stuff that's clearly going to come on stream that is going to happen anyway, as you try to ramp up and amplify those messages right at the critical point. And it is very important to kind of direct the PM's time on this appropriately. So as we've all said, there will be moments of cut through which come in the sort of in the way that only really the PM can generate, allied to the news environment. Allegra will be a supplement to all of that, and in a way, if the timings do line up, then the novelty of there being on-camera press briefings for the first time is something that government can use to its advantages, because at the very least people will be watching. And part of the the problem I think we've all identified on this webinar today is about the fact that the government is trying to get people to pay attention during a completely unprecedented time where their attention is quite rightly drawn elsewhere. So, you know, if nothing else, Allegra will be able to command a certain amount of public interest because of the novelty. So, yeah, you know, I have no doubt she'll do a very good job in doing that.
Good. That's a very diplomatic point on which to end. So I think I'm going to just thank all our panelists as we've come to the end of our time. I think the big message there is that there are a lot of difficult stories to get out, and government's got a major task, but it also has perhaps the fact that lockdown is resolved for the time being, to use the opportunity of November to start preparing people, but also to watch for all those potential human interest stories that people will be feeding to Lisa and her.
I think we may have lost Jill, so I'd just like to say, yes, please. Sorry, thank you very much for watching. Yes, do take a look at our IFG Live links on our website, where you can find a recording of this event and others. And you'll also find our recent report on how ready the UK is to the end of the transition period, which picks up on some of the themes from our event today. So thanks again to the panel. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you again soon.